Hey, everybody. Great to be with you guys. If you're new with us, my name's Jeff, and I'm one of the pastors here. And I got to say, I'm so glad that you decided to join us. As we say, it is always so good to be together. So, welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm glad that you made it. In case you're wondering what you walked into, kind of what this looks like, or who you're around, we say this all the time. So, maybe if you've been around for a while, maybe you're getting tired of us saying it. But this is a group of people who do not have all the answers, and we're doing our best to walk with Jesus, to aim our lives at Him, to walk with Him, and we do not have that all figured out. In fact, this is part of the best, probably the best part about being together is because we don't have it all figured out. We got each other to rely on. So, and we say this as well, that the best stuff we have in our church isn't what happens in the screen or on any of our programs or anything like that. The best stuff we got going in our church is the other people. So relax, you're in good company. And hopefully you find this to be a place you can call home and maybe take a next step with us. So anyway, let's get right to it. We'll be a lot to cover today. Let me ask you this. I don't know if this is a really specific question, so it's a little weird. Have you ever seen a puppy like discover its own reflection for the first time? Like just watch this for a minute. This is a dog discovering its own reflection. Look at this, how confused this dog is. Who is that other dog and why is it so hyper? Why is it freaking out so much? So this little puppy clearly is mystified by his or her, I don't know, that's whatever, but mystified by its own reflection. And it's looking at this other dog going, why is it so hyper? Why is it so curious? Why is that dog so angry? And it's facing the question as it looks into the mirror, what's wrong with that dog? What's wrong with that dog? To say it a little bit differently, which would be just simply this question, which would be, what am I going to do with that little tiny monster in the mirror that keeps barking at me? What am I going to do with that monster in the mirror? Now, 3 weeks ago, we started a series called All the Little Monsters. And as we've been talking about it, what we've said is basically on this premise that any monster anywhere is a problem that needs to be resolved. Like it's not just okay that we should let it go. But what we've been discovering over the past couple of weeks is that the reason why we often have so much hostility for something like a monster in someone else or someone else that we see is because those monsters tend to live undetected within us. So really, when we're talking about all that stuff that we got to deal with out there, all those problems out there, more often than not, what we're actually talking about is not a them problem, it's an us problem. And what we also have been able to kind of discuss is that if we don't deal with those things, if we don't deal with those monsters, we actually start becoming those monsters. Galatians 5 says it this way. Remember, this is a letter written, this letter in Galatians is written to church people. It's the early church that's kind of gathered there. And it's a group of churches in central Turkey. And here's what it says in Galatians 5. If you bite and devour each other, watch out or you'll be destroyed by each other. So, meaning there's something within us human beings that even people who are part of the church community, it turns out, if we're not careful, if we're not vigilant, we might actually start acting like this, biting and devouring. We might actually start behaving like monsters that we never intended to. Now, there is a particular monster we have to talk about that actually appears in our mirror more often than we probably would like to realize. It's crazy because we actually welcome it into our own life. We actually welcome the presence of this particular kind of thing. And it speaks with a voice that sounds very much like our own voice. And it's very authoritative. And it convinces us oftentimes that its voice becomes our own voice. And it tends to find the very worst parts of us and then convince us that it's like this is all you'll ever be. That's a pretty insidious kind of monster. So what am I going to do with that monster that's in the mirror, the one that I see there sometimes? Raise your hand. Okay, again, just bear with me. Raise your hand if you ever heard some version of this statement. If someone talked to you the way that you talk to yourself, you would have kicked that person out of your life a long, long time ago. Just show of hands. How many have heard something like that? If someone talked to you the way that you talk to yourself, you would have kicked that person out of your life a long time ago. Yeah, it's a pretty common way to think about stuff. But the problem for us is the reason why we keep going back to that person is because that person who's talking feels right. I mean, because we know. I mean, we know our own past and our present, and we have pretty good, we assume, about predicting our own future too. And so in that situation, when we hear something that sounds like us, talking like us, and saying some things to us, even if it's not all that wonderful, we tend to believe it because it feels right. In fact, when it comes to us, we've always believed that we're the realist in the room. But there's some research that says there's something different than that we ought to consider. Here's the article. It says this: you don't know yourself perfectly, and as a matter of fact, we probably all overestimate our capacity for accurate self-knowledge. Many studies have shown how flawed people's self-assessments are, and psychological experiments have revealed that ratings of one's own skill and performance are moderate to meager in accuracy. Like, how well do you think you did? Pretty great. You're moderate to meager at best, right? Scholars have demonstrated that we can't even predict our future behavior better than others can predict it for us. One reason we know ourselves so poorly is that we're prone to major cognitive errors about what we see happening in our lives. Researchers have found that humans are vulnerable to gross omissions to the extent that we miss seeing our problems, mistakes, and our opportunities. We exist, you might say, in a fog of meta-ignorance. Not only do we not know ourselves, we don't know ourselves. Think about that for a second. It's a little Jedi. But you get what this is saying here. It's saying that the loudest, most convincing, and often most critical voice in our lives, the one that has the most sway over us, the one that we've given the most authority to most often than that, is our own voice. Because we believe we know ourselves better than anybody else, and that voice is super inaccurate. We trust it the most, submit ourselves under it the most, and it's often the most inaccurate. A 2023 Time article adds another layer to this perceived authority thing. Here's what it says. There are two broad types of self-criticism, notes Lakeisha Sullivan, a clinical psychologist based in Atlanta. Some of these thoughts are first-person I statements, like, I'm so lazy. Others use second-person language, you didn't go to the gym all week, and the latter tend to be particularly insidious. Our brains process those kinds of thoughts as if someone in a position of authority is talking to us, she says. They know all our flaws and they pretend like they can predict the future. The accusation from a perceived authority, which in this case is our own self-criticism, which has this kind of angle of criticism to us, as soon as we speak in the second person to ourselves, like potentially in the mirror, we believe the words and we internalize them as truth because it's perceived as a kind of authority. And if that's the case, then some monster in some particular way that looks like that is particularly destructive. It's incredibly familiar and it's unrelenting. Now, let's take a look at a particular story that may bring some light to this. Now, in the 5th century BC, after God's people have been invaded by both the Babylonians and the Persians, what's left of Israel is essentially what's just called a remnant of people. And there's no king. There's a guy named Joshua. There's lots of Joshuas in the Bible, but it's one Joshua. He's the high priest at this time. And then there's a prophet named Zechariah. So just to give you an idea about what all those roles are, which matters only to create a little bit of clarity. But the priest is someone who acts essentially, and this is an oversimplification, as a bridge for God's people. Between God and people is this, the technical term would be a mediator between God and people. He stands between them, makes a bridge. That's a priest, right? Then a prophet is someone who, more than anything else, speaks God's words to God's people. A prophet is, in effect, a messenger. And yes, there are other things a prophet does that they're known for, but by and large, what a prophet does is call people back to God, speaking God's truth with God's authoritative word to those people, right? That's a prophet. And then a king, just to make sure we round it all out here, a king is God's rule over God's people, which is a monarch, right? So you have all of these kinds of facts. These are the three major players in kind of the Israel history story we got to pay attention to. But these are the three categories anyways. So in this particular case, a guy named Zechariah is the prophet, as we mentioned, and he receives a vision. Now, some of you are like, I'm not sure I believe this stuff, visions and all that. That's okay. It's a really good question. We don't have time to deal with it at this particular point. So just for today, would you just take a moment and just kind of take what you see, what Zechariah receives, just as it is, and wrestle with that stuff? It's a good question for another time. But he gets a message about the high priest, this guy Joshua. So here's the message. Here's the vision that he gets. In Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1. Then he showed me, meaning God showed me. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord. So there's Joshua the high priest, and this angel of the Lord is essentially describing God's presence himself. Oftentimes when a person called the angel of the Lord shows up in the Bible, that person speaks in first person as though it is actually God's presence. So you get the idea. God is not only giving him a vision, he's speaking as though he's in this particular story. So then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord and Satan standing at his right side to accuse him. Okay, here we go. Now, first of all, when you see the word Satan, a lot of us have all kinds of images about that. But just again, for this particular instance, let's just get to what we just need for this story. First of all, Satan is almost never in the Hebrew scriptures written as just the word Satan. It usually includes the article the. So you see it as the word ha-satan, like that. That means ha is the. So it's the word when you see Satan is the Satan, which is a little bit strange for a lot of us. We don't think of it in those terms. But the Satan, the accuser, is how it's actually translated. Satan is translated as accuser or adversary sometimes. Sometimes people will just use the phrase the enemy or enemy. They're talking here about Satan being the enemy or the accuser, the adversary. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, which I know it's a lot of languages right there, in the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, it's actually translated as the false accuser. So Jesus will later use different terms to describe Satan, one of them being the father of lies. But you get the basic gist here is that there is this person who's now apparently standing alongside Joshua and this angel of the Lord. So, and he's there to accuse, right? So a better translation might be, then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and thus Satan standing at his right side to accuse him. The accuser standing there to accuse him, if that makes sense. All right, verse 2. The Lord said to Satan, the Lord rebuke you, Satan. So now you have this picture where there's three people standing there, Joshua, the angel of the Lord, and of course the accuser here. And the angel of the Lord turns and rebukes Satan just immediately. I silence you. I send you back. I reject you. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this man a burning stick snatched from the fire? Now, a lot of language here. Basically, what's just being described here is that, remember, this is a small remnant of people who have been left over after all kinds of captivity and all kinds of punishment and torture and all that other kind of stuff. And what's left is just a few people. And God is saying from the very outset of this particular, whatever this sort of meeting is, that this vision is, from the very beginning, God says, I've chosen these people, this Jerusalem, this city, my own people. I've chosen them. And I've rescued this one particular guy, the representative, this priest. I'm standing with them and their priest, their bridge, the person between me and them. But in this particular instance, the accuser kind of has a case to be made. Because the very next thing tells us about the state of Joshua. Here's what we get. Zechariah chapter 3, verse 3. Now Joshua was dressed in what can only be described as filthy clothes as he stood before the angel. The word filthy isn't really quite strong enough for what actually ought to be described there. It's all derivative from this particular kind, or derived from these kinds of words right here, excrement or dung. It means that this is not just like a coffee stain. It's not just like, oh, you got something on your shirt. It's like there's an odor and a clear kind of disgrace that's part of the whole thing here. It's not just like, well, that's kind of a bummer. I need to change a shirt. It's really hideous. In fact, the overall effect of this particular kind of characterization would be simply that this person will be banished from public and ceremonial life. Now, banished from public life is a big deal, but if you're the high priest and are banished from ceremonial life, that means everybody suffers. In effect, what's being described by these particular clothes is that Joshua is being described as a person who's unfit to be a priest, which means the people suffer. And there's another layer here. What's being described is that this particular kind of filth isn't just that's just dirty or even excrement or dung. There's something else. There's another factor here, which you get back in verse 4. Then he said to Joshua, see, I've taken away your sin. Oh, so we have the angel stood before those who were standing before him saying, take off his filthy clothes. Then he said to Joshua, see, I've taken away your sin, which not just I've taken away your clothes, I've taken away your sin, and I will put fine garments on you. You get the picture here now of exactly what's happening. What's happening is that there's not only the clothes dirty, but that they're also representative of something else, the people's sin and Joshua's sin as well. And what ought to be considered as we look at this particular part of the story is this. In no uncertain terms, the clothes are dirty. The clothes are dirty, which is I mean, even the angel said it, right? Hey, look, we got to change these filthy clothes. Now, what's interesting about that is, on the one, we live in strange times. And on the one hand, we kind of are overwhelmed with the message that you're perfect. Nothing, don't change anything, never change. Gosh, you're wonderful and perfect the way that you are. And so is everybody else. But the only problem is we keep encountering other people who aren't always acting wonderful. And we don't always feel that way. And on the other hand, as we kind of talk about this, we have a kind of hyper focus on our own inadequacy. We're constantly reminding ourselves, and people are constantly reminding us, that we're never good enough. And we're terrified that people will find out that we're not good enough, especially as more and more of our lives are lived in a way that's more and more public. Everything that we do that we mess up about, we're just so worried that someone will capture it and then mock us to no end. But either way, whether we live in the you're perfect kind of version of our world, or we live in the I'm always inadequate, either way, everybody's deeply anxious. And what's being described here that has to be addressed is that everybody in the particular scenario here is aware that the clothes are dirty. They're actually filthy. And what God sees, he sees that it's something that has to be addressed. God sees what is actually wrong in the scenario, and he addresses it. Which means God does the laundry. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm just trying to say, and by the way, you can't reverse that. If you have chores in your house and you do the laundry, you can't be like, look, this is what I heard at church this weekend. I must be something special. Just bear with me for the story. God does the laundry, not Joshua is the point, meaning the whole work of changing out these old and disgusting clothes, those aren't the work of Joshua. I mean, the message isn't, hey, Joshua, you are disgusting. These clothes are disgusting. Get your act together so you can do this. That's really not the message here. The message is these clothes are dirty. I'm going to remove them. And I'll give you some new clothes. The whole thing is initiated by God and carried out by some kind of divine ministry and divine means. But there's another layer we still have to consider. And it's really easy to skip. Because somewhere between the old and disgusting, the filthy clothes, and the new clothes, no matter how disgusting those old things might have been or become, no matter how dirty they are, there's a moment between the old clothes and the new clothes where Joshua is going to have to be fully exposed to be completely naked. Like, maybe that's why it's so hard for us sometimes to let go of an old life that we don't even want. Because there's a moment, the worst thing for us may not be the filth or the part of us that we know has to change or we have to let go of, that the worst thing might actually be that we're exposed. Maybe that's why we hold on to some of these things. It's not that we don't want, it's just the middle. It's not we don't want something new. It's just that middle part. Naked. Does that have any resonance for you? Now, back to the story. Joshua's getting dressed. Verse 5. Then I said, put a clean turban on his head. So this is interesting. Zechariah, apparently the prophet, is chiming in here. Then I said, put a clean turban on his head. So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him while the angel of the Lord stood by. Now, this is really kind of interesting. Turban, literally, the word turban comes from just means it's like a winding kind of a hat. So if you can imagine a wound or a winding kind of hat. This is actually part of the high priest's outfit. It's really important. In fact, when some 800 years before this moment, when the first high priest is being dressed or being described how he is to be dressed, this is how it's described in Exodus chapter 29. Take the garments and dress Aaron, he's the first high priest, with the tunic and the robe of the ephod and the ephod itself and the breastplate. Now, ephod's like basically just think of a sleeveless shirt, more or less, you get the idea. Fasten the ephod on him by its skillfully woven waistband, like a chest piece. Put the turban on his head and attach the sacred emblem to the turban. Take the anointing oil and anoint him by pouring it on his head. So a couple things that kind of will make this make sense. So you have this high priest dressed in these particular kinds of clothes and all of the particularly made stuff, neatly, skillfully made stuff. And then you put this turban on his head with a sacred emblem. What we know from another part of the Bible is that on the sacred emblem is the words, "Holy to the Lord." set apart, in other words, it's holy, set apart for the purposes of serving the Lord. This last part of the anointing oil just simply means then this is a way of marking as though someone's specially chosen. It also is a way of symbolizing God's presence to do a particular work. So then at the kind of finishing moment of dressing this man, Joshua, the high priest, is that he would wear this person. Remember what he was wearing before. He's now called holy to the Lord. Back to the passage, verse 6. The angel of the Lord gave this charge to Joshua. This is what the Lord Almighty says. If you will walk in obedience to me and keep my requirements, then you will govern my house and have charge of my courts, and I will give you a place among these standing here. So you get the picture. There's all of this sort of stuff. What you have to keep in mind as we look at it specifically for us today is that the order goes like this. Remove the old thing, replace it with something new, and then recommission or reinstate the particular leader. In this case, it's the high priest. Now, what's fascinating about this particular chunk of scripture right here, these verses, is that what scholars will tell us is that a lot of what's being described is the stuff that kings do, not priests. Like what's happening in this moment in the absence of a king is that there's a fusion between a priest and a king that's happening here. So it's not just a return to regular priestly duties. Apparently, there's this other stuff that's being sort of involved here, this kind of governance piece, a fusion of priest and king. We'll come back to that in a second. Now, notice how God addresses Joshua after this moment. Listen, high priest Joshua. That doesn't sound like the voice of any kind of accuser. It sounds like something else. That sounds, he doesn't refer to him by any of these other things. He just says, high priest Joshua. You and your associates seated before you, presumably the other priests, who are men symbolic of things to come. You are a sign of some things to come, is what's being said here. I'm going to bring my servant, the branch. What it's being said here is this: you and your crew, it's seated right here in this particular vision. You guys are a sign of things to come. I'm going to bring my servant, the branch. Now, this is a really interesting phrase. I know there's a lot of sort of weird language here. Let me just try to break that down. This is a reference to a future king, the branch. The branch will show up throughout the Bible as this kind of like, there'll be this branch. It's an offshoot. And usually I should say this way, as far as I know, it's always, I don't know if it's always, it's in reference to a particular lineage out of the line of a person named David, who's Israel's most famous but far from perfect king, who actually from him is supposed to be this other future ruler, a person who's called the Messiah, who's also the prophet and the priest and a king. So to understand what's happening here, pull this together a little bit. The formerly filthy rags wearing unqualified Joshua, who would have been banned and banished from all kinds of public and ceremonial life, is remade into the image that's foreshadowing the arrival of Jesus, the one who fuses together the once and final prophet, priest, and king. I mean, think about where the story started and where he is now. But there's one more critical thing to consider. Not once in any of these verses did the accuser speak at all. Not once. I mean, what we have is a setting, right? There's the angel of the Lord, there's Joshua, and then there's this accuser person, and the accuser is silenced before he can even begin to make his case. Without going too far into this, if God's not giving the, quote, false accuser a voice, then maybe we ought to consider not giving that accuser a voice either, even if his voice starts to sound like our own. Now, what do we do with this then? Because the issue we're really facing is if there's a false accuser, which there is, the Bible's describing this person who is real. If there is a false accuser who does manage to sometimes attach himself to us so that we see ourselves in the mirror as the truth teller about ourselves, what we have to figure out then is how do we, if we sort of step into these lies and live by them, how do we separate then the truth from the lies so that we're no longer confused? Because we live in a world this is such a unique world where we live in the time period where the phrase fake news and the phrase alternative truth have come to be in our own lexicon. We actually say these words now. These weren't words a while ago. So how is it in our particular world that we're able to separate between lies and truth? Let's start with the lies. First, a definition of a lie, a lot of different ways you could talk about this, is the intentional misrepresentation of reality. Like we know what is, and we're talking about something that isn't that. That's what a lie does. The intentional misrepresentation of reality. And if that's true, then the accuser is full of lies. And that accuser is saying things that sound like this. The stains and the smell that you have got on your life, they're all you'll ever be. You have made a mess. We all know it. This is all that you'll ever be. You have made some mistakes. You're automatically disqualified and there's no place for you. And if you were, in fact, as you ought to have been or ought to be, God would see you and he would love you. He would. He really would. But you aren't and he won't. Lies. Lies. If people truly saw you for who you are, who could blame them for abandoning you? So it would be better if you just went and hid. Just you go hide. Just run away. All of those kinds of phrases are misrepresentations of reality intentionally, and it stinks. But it's just the right size. It may stink and it may be dirty, but it fits so well. And as soon as we start wearing it, we start seeing the monster in the mirror and it starts sounding really authoritative. What does that look like? Usually these things start as a wound or a trauma or something that's happened to us in our past that gets supercharged, the volume gets turned up, the power is up on it. I'll give you an example from my own life. For me, what fits, unfortunately, is an old message. It's a family wound. And the wound goes like this, and it's me taking a thing and it's just been blown up in my life over multiple times in my life. And this is still something I have to work through. But the message I get in my relationships now is, we don't care if you're here or not. We don't need you, and we barely notice you. It's not that we don't like you, Jeff. It's just this is again, this is the internal dialogue I have that I'm predicting about how people see me. It's not that we don't like you or that we hate you. It's just that it just makes no difference. It makes no difference whether you're here or you're not here. You're kind of expendable. That's a way to think about it. You know, I always, for the longest time in my life, and still to this day, I'm like, I have to remind myself this isn't the truth, right? But I get confused when people are bummed when I don't call them in the time that they have a particular need because I didn't think it mattered. This is weird, by the way, for a pastor to have this, right? And I'm also weirded out when people call me in my particular time of need. I didn't think that I didn't even know that I was sort of, I'm always sort of thrown off. Like, why are they reaching out to me? In many respects, what you could say is I didn't know it mattered if I mattered. So I took this particular kind of wound message and I just mapped it onto the world. Because I could make sense of the world that way. This is the way I navigated by it. And I kept hearing that message over and over. What about you? Where is there an intentional misrepresentation of reality such that it's managing to get a hold of your heart and beginning to map itself onto reality, something that you're believing and applying over different circumstances in your life, and it's forming you into a particular thing that you were never intended to be? That's a lie. Now then, if a lie is the intentional misrepresentation of reality, then a truth, obviously, is the accurate representation of reality. This is what God says to Joshua, and I'll kind of paraphrase it a bit here, but under all of those clothes, you're still the one that I've called. Like, I saw you underneath all that stuff, and you're still the one I've called. What God says in this particular instance is, look, I'll replace the old stuff with something new. He seems to be saying there's something about you. You're the one I've called. I'll replace the old with the new. And there's also one more thing. Yeah, there's some stuff we're going to have to address in your life. It may not be comfortable, but because I love you, I can't ignore it either. So we got to deal with it. That's the truth. There's some stuff we got to address, but because I love you, I can't ignore it either. See, one way to think about the truth is you and I are trying to determine what it is that's actually true and what's a lie. Here's one sort of test that might help to kind of just give one more step on truth. It's this. The truth comes to us essentially in two parts. One is the reality of my condition, which is changeable. Whatever it is that the condition that you and I face, moral or otherwise, it is changeable. This is part of the beauty of the Bible, and the world will tell us more often than not, surprisingly, you really can't change. You are fated to be whoever you are, but the Bible is a cover-to-cover story of people who were headed in a direction and then turned to go another way. The truth is in two parts. One, the reality of my condition, that condition is changeable. And secondly, the reality of my worth, which is not changeable. The reality of our condition is that it does change, right? And those are things that, well, we're occasionally wonderful and sometimes we're not, right? And sometimes, well, we're always a work in progress. Those things are changing. And the reality of my worth. The Bible will tell us this way. This is love, not that we first loved God, but that he loved us. And that never changes. Occasionally, a lie will sound really good because it will just flip those two things. It will just say, look, your worth is changeable and your conditions are not. The truth is this. You have a reality to your condition, and you also have a reality to your worth, which is beyond measure. Now, to deal with that monster that shows up in the mirror, this accusatory voice of authority that shows up, I want to give you a really simple prayer. I'm not sure you're, willing to do that or whatever, but however it is that you might just begin to sort of wrestle with this as you walk a dog, or maybe you're staring at a puppy in a mirror, maybe you're just having a little bit of time alone, maybe if you're reading your own Bible, whatever it is, maybe this is a prayer you might try. Father, show me what's true. Show me what's true. I'm having a hard time determining what is and what is not true. Father, would you show me what's true? Would you show me what's true about me? The stuff that never changes, that you love me, that you came for me, that you died for me, that you came to rescue me from myself, even when I didn't think I needed it, when I didn't deserve it, when I was wearing the filthy clothes, that you saw me beneath all of it, and you still see me, and that you walk with me, and that you say to whomever might be accusing, or whatever might be accusing, or the accuser himself, you say, do you not see that I'm standing with this person? I'm standing with you. I'm standing with this person who I snatched from the fire, as it says, a stick from the fire. They're mine. Father, show me what's true about me, but also show me what's true about you. Help me distinguish your voice from the voice of an accuser. Help me to understand that it is you who wants and believes and is working to shape me and to become something I never could become on my own. Father, show me what's true. What's true about me. And what's true about you. That's how you deal with that monster in the mirror. Let's pray together, everybody. Jesus, just for this moment as we get a chance to sit still, would you show me what's true? And maybe thy sort of seeing what's true, what's not true would be made known. So it doesn't have a hold on me any longer. Father, show me what's true about you. Show me what's true about me. It's in your name we pray. Amen.